On va commencer par des remerciements. Merci beaucoup à Marc Nouvonnery, tiens, pourquoi pas, d'avoir organisé tout ça, l'enregistrement, la réservation de salle et tout ça. Merci beaucoup à Ariane Lemoyel de nous avoir donné l'occasion de recevoir à nouveau David, et à Rémi et d'autres d'avoir manifesté un certain enthousiasme, Jean-Christophe aussi pour le soutien. Et donc, sans plus attendre, je vais juste dire un tout petit peu qui est David Healy pour ceux qui ne le savent pas du tout. Donc c'est un psychopharmacologue, psychiatre, qui a une activité soignante et qui a beaucoup travaillé autour de la problématique des effets indésirables des antidépresseurs et des neurotropes, des médicaments neurotropes en général. Et même s'il a écrit sur d'autres aspects, il a quand même écrit énormément de choses à ce sujet et autour de ce sujet, une vingtaine d'ouvrages de type livre et des publications scientifiques qui sont à plus de 200. Et il va nous parler aujourd'hui d'un sujet un peu étrange, je pense, mais qui manifeste, je pense, la qualité de sa réflexion, qui est un peu orthogonale, enfin, ou parallèle, je ne sais pas trop, par rapport à celle qu'on peut avoir dans le laboratoire de pharmacologie et de thérapeutique, dans lequel travaillent pas mal d'entre nous, où on est très orienté, peut-être pas de façon suffisamment critique, sur l'evidence-based medicine. Et lui, il a une vision extrêmement originale par rapport à ce contexte, ce paradigme sur lequel beaucoup de gens se positionnent aujourd'hui. Et je pense qu'il a une pensée profonde, de nature plutôt épistémologique et philosophique que simplement médicale. Et il nous invite à une réflexion, à une remise en question de pas mal de nos fondements de raisonnement médical, ou même du patient. Et puis au-delà des interactions entre les différents acteurs de la société, et évidemment l'industrie pharmaceutique qui fabrique des médicaments qui pour certains en cardiologie par exemple sont vraiment extrêmement utiles sans beaucoup de discussion. Puis il y a d'autres situations, et même en cardiologie, où l'utilité peut beaucoup plus se discuter, la façon dont on utilise ces médicaments. Et donc je pense qu'il a vraiment une vision très originale, très profonde, dérangeante, mais très utile, et je le remercie infiniment. Thank you so much to come, and we'll hear him talk with pleasure.
Thank you very much, François.
Il y a encore des copies papier.
Ariane, donc, pour ceux qui verraient la vidéo ou qui assistent aujourd'hui sans avoir d'aisance en anglais évidente, il y a la possibilité de suivre en se connectant à ce lien. Tout de suite, on a la traduction papier, et puis il y a des versions papier, la traduction en français du texte qu'il va présenter, et puis une version française. Personne n'en a envie? On a besoin?
Thank you very much, François, for that. I came to Lyon first, 25 years ago, to interview a group of doctors and researchers who had a huge impact on the way we view mental illness and the psychotropic drugs. And I didn't know then, but I've now been back to Lyon on 5 occasions. I've made a lot of friendships here. I owe a great deal to François here for this visit, to Bruno Arlet, who's just over here for some previous visits, to Ariane, whom you see here down in the front, who's helped create this visit also. But also, I mean, there's good and fond reasons for me to remember this visit, including the fact that I've never given a talk in a lecture theatre like this. It looks really great. But there's some sad reasons, too, at the heart of this talk. Yoko and Vincent. Vincent is just there, and Yoko is standing up by the camera up there. Had a son called Roman, who committed suicide, almost certainly, in my opinion, triggered by an antidepressant 2 years ago at the age of 16. So, one of the things that's critical for me is the drugs we use can do great good. They can also do great harm. And one of the problems that we have at the moment is we're not willing to recognize the harms, and increasingly finding it harder to recognize the harms. So that's at the heart of this talk. So the issues really start with the French Revolution. And the slide has not gone forward. Now it has. Okay. During the 18th century in England and France, I'm neither English nor French, I'm Irish. A group of people who call themselves liberals, and that, to begin with, meant that you had freedom of choice regarding the religion you believed in. You could choose to be Catholic or Protestant or Huguenot, and it seemed a good idea that you had this freedom of choice without getting your head chopped off. But once you have freedom of choice for religion, people felt, well, you should have freedom of choice in other areas of life as well. And this is what helped create the free market. And the French had a huge role in this. Concepts like laissez-faire, entrepreneur, and all are all French concepts. And some of the people who played a part in this were doctors. There were no such thing as economists back then. The doctors played a huge role then, and as you'll hear, they've played a role for the last 200 years also. So one of the things that the free market gave rise to was technologies. And as Louis XVI is having his head chopped off here with a new technology, clinical medicine is being created in France. The man who created the medical model, Philippe Pinel, is in the audience while the king is having his head chopped off. It was instruments like the stethoscope, techniques like being able to stain tissues and see where the tuberculosis bacterium was. These were the technologies that helped create clinical medicine. At the same time, in France, people were creating public health, which doesn't depend on technology so much as processes, techniques. At the heart of both of these is the word techne. So let me move on from Paris, which was a small part of the revolution, to Lyon, which was a much more important part of the revolution. And in the 1830s in Lyon, I'm sure all of you will know this history much more than I do, workers were revolting in the sense that they were being replaced by machines, and the silk workers in particular in Lyon were actually getting very militant and saying, it isn't just the machines replacing us and our jobs, but working through machines alienates us from the skills of our own hands, of our own judgment calls. There's a loss of personality here. And this led two people to look with interest at what was happening in Lyon. One was a man called Etienne Cabet, who founded the Communist Party in Lyon. And the other person was Louis-René Villermé, who was really the person who is most responsible for founding public health as we know it today, and occupational health. And he came down here to Lyon to look at what was going on, the conditions of the workers, the consequences of the change from being able to work with your hands to being forced to work with machines. So in France, around this time, the 1830s, the 1840s, there was a lot of ferment, which ultimately exploded in a set of revolutions in 1848. Shortly before that, in England, you have a man called Friedrich Engels, who owns a factory in England, who writes a book called The Condition of the Working Class in England. Now, to most people who haven't read the book, that sounds like a political book. It sounds like an economics book. It's not. It's a public health book. It could have been written by Vierme. A lot of people were writing the same kind of books at that time. Engels may not have written it. You don't necessarily expect a German to write incisive things. He had an Irish partner who may have been the person that really wrote this book. But anyway, Engels, as you know, teamed up with Karl Marx, and in 1848, when revolutions broke out, first in France and then across Europe, Marx and Engels produced this short, brief book, which again, it's not economics. At the same time as Marx and Engels were putting forward ideas that we think as communist now, the liberals who set up the conditions that triggered the French Revolution in Paris were saying the same kind of thing, as you'll see. A lot of the people leading the revolutions in France and Germany were doctors. And both the communists and liberals were saying everybody needs to vote. Both of them were saying we need more education. Both of them were saying we need the state to wither away, which it did. By the state, they meant the aristocracy. The state withered away. One of the problems, though, you get when you chop the king's head off, we still need leadership. So where's the leadership going to come from? Down there, I've got the word medicine, but that's just to remind me to let you know that a lot of this, there were more doctors on the barricades than there were economists. And this is Germany, and this is Rudolf Virchow, who's saying medicine is a social science, and politics is nothing more than medicine on a grand scale. Now, Virchow agreed with Marx on almost everything, except Marx thought the proletariat were going to be the people that ultimately changed the way we live. Virchow figured it was going to be doctors. They were going to be the revolutionary class. And at this point in time, liberal professionalism had been born. Virchow said, doctors should not be paid by the state. You guys should look at doctors and figure they've got something useful to offer, and that's why you'd come to us and pay us. Okay, so that's an idea to some extent that's been lost. At the time, you need to appreciate science was emerging, and science looked like the kind of thing doctors could offer that people might pay for. Okay, so there's a few things here just to summarize this little bit of the talk. The issue is, why does history move forward? And Marx gave a view that there's a process rolling through history which has replaced the aristocracy with the bourgeois and is going to replace the bourgeois with the proletariat. But, I mean, the point is he's saying things move forward, which they do. And in our day, they seem to be moving forward quicker and quicker. We're not quite sure where we're going. But 300 or 400 years ago, we thought God's providence is what drove history forward. Then we began thinking in terms of individual genius, Shakespeare, Molière, and the scientists. It was the genius of individual people that drove things forward, which of course couldn't be the case really, because great men really don't drive anything forward. It's great women that do it, and there weren't any women being mentioned in all this. Marx introduced the idea of class struggle, but technologies had been driving things forward at that point, and he saw it, the technologies, as it were owned by the capitalists, and he blamed the capitalists rather than the technology. Some years later, Max Weber, who was a liberal, not a communist, came to a different point of view, which lots of people who, like Marx, like Weber as well, which is interesting. It was almost saying the opposite to what Marx said. He said, you know, we've got rid of the aristocracy, but we've replaced them with a bureaucracy. And bureaucracy is rather like technology, except it's technique. Rather than having a machine which gives you if X, then Y, you've got a set of procedures which give you if X, then Y. And Weber said, look, we've got bureaucrats who adhere to procedure religiously, and I can't see any way to stop them, he said. This is limitless. It's going to take over the way we live. It's going to create what he called an iron cage, and what people in the United States, particularly on the right these days, would call the deep state. When Donald Trump comes to power, that the bureaucrats are going to frustrate him. And what the Republicans, well, what Trump would like to do is to take all the bureaucrats out and shoot them. So Weber saw this as where Marx saw technology being owned by capitalists, Weber saw technique being owned by socialists. And the job was to try and bring the two together somehow so that we didn't get destroyed by either of them. So after, many years later, 30 years later, towards the end of World War II, you get a creation of what's sometimes called neoliberalism. And one of the books that people talk about is this book by Friedrich Hayek. But there were more books than that and more people than just Hayek. And the kind of thinking behind this book is traced back to a set of meetings in the Mont Pelerin Society. And this group of people were reacting to the Soviet Union, the control of everything which was being built or sold by the Soviets at that point as the way forward. Extreme central planning. But not just that. They were also saying, we don't like the encroachment of social democracy in Europe. Now, if you check neoliberalism, if you go onto Wikipedia, if you read any books which even with the name neoliberalism in it, you find it very hard to work out, at least I find it very hard to work out what neoliberalism is. No one actually defines it. It can't be rolling back the state to 1848. To some extent, it is about getting rid of bureaucracy, but I think there's something else to it which I'm going to try and bring out and show you how it applies in healthcare today. Around the time that the Mont Pelerin Society meetings were happening, in the United States there was a set of Josiah Macy conferences which were set up, this will appeal to Bruno, set up by the US military after World War II. And part of what they were doing was saying, look, we've used computers during the war for things like targeting artillery. Can they be used after the war to generally improve the way that we do things? And the argument was, you've got things like thermostats which were being used, which are a very simple algorithm. If the temperature goes up to this point, you turn the air conditioning on. If it goes down to this point, you turn the heating system on. And a view that had been put forward by the physiocrats in France 200 years earlier was, well, homeostasis is a little bit like that. You know, when things go this way in the body, there's compensatory mechanisms to turn them off. That's rather like an algorithm. And this is what led to what's called operational thinking. It's the science behind what we call management these days. And here's some quotes which give you a feel. These are two of the big names behind this kind of approach, which were saying, look, you know, we've got this big problem between the free market and the central planning approach. cybernetics, which is a word for computing and algorithms, may have come just in time to help us steer a course between extreme free marketing and extreme central planning. And this is, here is a quote as well. The approach behind cybernetics comes from the hard sciences, which we all support, like compared with the soft sciences, which are a bit tricky. This is going to give us a science of regulation. So, this is regulation. About 1900, there was an approach where people said, we can't just have a free market. We've got to have a free and responsible market. So this is the origins of the idea of regulation. And everything we have, from food to automobiles to planes to the stock market, has regulation these days, all of which is designed to keep you and me safe. That's the point behind it. Now, something extraordinary happened in 1962. In the 1950s, we got more and better drugs than we've ever had at any other point in history before that. Prior to 1950, we had almost nothing that worked. By the end of the 1950s, we had wonderful antihypertensives, wonderful antidepressants, wonderful antipsychotics, great hypoglycemics. We had treatments for cancer and all sorts of things, some of which have never been improved on, and none of which were brought into the market through an RCT. Not a single RCT in sight during the 1950s. We then had the thalidomide crisis, which led to the picture you see here. It led to the 1962 Food and Drugs Act. And John F. Kennedy, whom you see here, has just signed the act into being and gallantly gets up and hands the pen with which he signed the act over to Frances Kelsey, who's the woman who has blocked thalidomide getting on the US market. You'll notice she's the only woman in the room. The other aspect to this, though, is that the 1962 Act, unlike any other bit of regulation we have ever had, takes the focus away from safety. They don't mean to do it, but that's what they do. They say, we're going to introduce randomized controlled trials as a way for companies to get their drugs on the market. The companies were hostile to the idea because it was clear, well, it seemed clear to everybody this was going to make it harder for companies, but very quickly they came around and realized that they could make this work for them. And they began going around telling doctors you should practice according to the latest RCT evidence. But what's happening here in the case of RCTs, you're having not just the replacement of a focus on safety to a focus on efficacy, you're having a replacement from individual judgment. Frances Kelsey, under the 1938 Act, kept thalidomide off the market. It was her judgment call that a sleeping pill should not cause peripheral neuropathy that kept the drug off the market. And her judgment, and all of our judgments, were being replaced with RCTs, which are an algorithmic approach to making a judgment about what a drug does. So, let me give you an example of this. 2 years before the Act came into being, the only placebo-controlled randomized trial of a drug that had never been on the market, the US market at that point in time, was done by Louis Lassagne, whom you see over there on the right. And this showed that thalidomide worked well and was entirely safe. It had no adverse effects. The person who introduced randomized controlled trials into the 1962 Act, forcing companies to prove their drugs worked, was Louis Lassagne. 2 years later, this trial, through which thalidomide had sailed without a problem, was introduced as the way to stop thalidomide happening again. So, There were other things apart from regulation that were changing during this period. We got marketing, we got propaganda, and marketing science, advertising science took off during the 19th century when companies learned how to sell you water for a high price. Marketing was doing more than that. It was trying to make sure you thought the way they wanted you to think. Not just, the idea that you'd actually be charged for water, but it was more shaping your mind about the products that they had. And propaganda is perhaps the best way to bring that out. It's a form of marketing, and the best propaganda is invisible, and medicine is the place where we have the very best propaganda, where company trials pass off as being science. It's completely invisible that this is just propaganda. This perhaps brings it out. I'm going to give you two quotes from two people before we begin to switch over to medicine. This is a US liberal, John Kenneth Galbraith, who will be viewed as being more on the left. And the paradox is the liberals were the party of the right, at least in Europe, but the Democrats in the United States are called liberal, and liberal, when used in that context, means socialist. So, there's this odd kind of paradox we've got. And here's Galbraith saying, in the free market we used to have firms which made things that we needed. They were responding to our needs, but things have changed with marketing that companies can create our wants. And they feed the products we have then into the wants that they've created. The other point that he's saying, though, is that the CEOs of these large corporations are bureaucrats. They're not entrepreneurs. They're not taking risks. They're all about managing the risks to the corporation, and we don't really know what that means for the world in which we live. The other person who was saying that there's a big problem with the way things are going was on the extreme right, and this was Milton Friedman from the Chicago School, who's saying we've got government of the people, by the bureaucrats, for the bureaucrats these days. And here's where he's saying, and this is actually applied to healthcare, he's saying that, people like Clinton and people like that are trying to roll back the state and trying to make healthcare more free market-based, supposedly. And Friedman is saying, well, they say the right words, but in actual fact, we don't have anything like private medicine in the United States. And anyone who has any friends who talk about getting healthcare in the United States will hear from your friends that it's the place that's the most bureaucratic in the world. If you want to get a pill, there's a whole bunch of inquiries that go through all sorts of endless layers of management before the insurance company maybe responds and says, yes, you can have this pill. So paradoxically, Friedman, in a sense, is right. US healthcare is close to the most socialist in the sense of the word, which is very bureaucratic. And I didn't point out to you, in the image of Max Weber you had earlier, we also had an image of Franz Kafka. So in terms of the way we live today, a lot of people in the States would say getting healthcare is a Kafkaesque process. It's just terribly hard to get decent healthcare. So what I'm calling neoliberalism, or I'm going to call neoliberalism, starts here in Chile in 1976. There's a revolution. The Chilean economy is falling apart. Inflation's going through the roof. And Pinochet calls in the Chicago School, the Mont Pelerin group in the United States, and asks them, what do we do? And they introduce an idea that's come from Milton Friedman, which says you have targets. You target the money supply. You stop people printing money, and if you just control that, or control the inflation figure ultimately everything in the country will come right. That's the argument. And soon afterwards, the UK government pick up the same idea. They pick up what at the time had been called Friedman's monetarism, but began to be called neoliberalism. And part of the argument was they were trying to get rid of bureaucracy, get government off people's back. But the new thing was the target. They introduced this to healthcare as well, and they got people in to work out how to manage an internal market in the national health system in the UK. And one of the consequences of that was the administrative costs for healthcare in the UK had been 3% of the health budget. They pretty soon became over 10% of the health budget. So we were paying for a lot of managers, well, bureaucrats who are now renamed managers. And one of the other places you see targets in play is here, in that the idea was put forward that the CEO of a company hasn't any duties to society at all. The company hasn't any duties to any part of society at all. They've just got a duty to the shareholders, and their duty is to ensure that the value of shares keeps going up. Now, what you're seeing here is targets, again, in terms of the way we run a company, are the way we run a country. And the response in the UK and Chile was very, very similar. Again, the government said, you know, we have a target, we just need to get the money supply down. The miners went on strike. The country more or less fell apart, but everybody was awfully happy because we were meeting the target. There was a clear thing that was being done that people could be happy about, and while there was a clear thing that could be done that people were being happy about, they could tolerate a lot of everything else going wrong. In terms of the right and the left and who is actually responsible for all this, here's Michel Foucault, and you know, he was thinking in a rather similar way, which was a target-based way. Hi, Mo. A target-based way that we're not going to be governed by leadership from the top down. We're now producing more and more data the whole time, and this is going to allow what's called governance rather than government. People on the left, like Clinton and Blair, were very similar. They were saying we'll set a target for things like healthcare, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a public service or a private company, provided they meet the target. What's the difference? On the left, you get people like Macron, who, well, notional left, who glory in the idea of being technocrats, which is seemingly a good thing. You know, being left or being right is old-fashioned. You just want to be a person who knows how to do the job, like coach the French team, for instance. But where does money fit into all this? Where does capitalism fit into all this? Well, Marx, as I said, blamed the capitalists, but here's Chuang Tzu in 323 BC giving you an other option, which is saying that it's obvious if you want to keep your homes, well, if you have a home and things like that, and you want to keep things secure against robbers who snatch purses, rifle luggage, crack safes, one must fasten all the property with ropes, lock it with locks, bolt it with bolts. For property owners, this is elementary good sense. But when a strong thief comes along, he picks it all up, puts it on his back, and goes on his way with only one worry, that the locks and the ropes and the bolts may give way. And it's the same with targets. If you nail things down to a target, it becomes the kind of thing, once it becomes predictable, it's the kind of thing that a hedge fund, well, it creates hedge funds, it creates people who speculate on the basis that we know this target is going to stay in the same place the whole time. And you end up with hedge funds that can tell the French government how to behave. So this is the shift to medicine. The Thatcher government in the UK comes into power at the end of 1979. 1980-81 is when they put the money targets in place. This is 1981 in medicine. And the target cultures moved into medicine there as well. This is looking at antihypertensives. A man called Jeffrey Rose has introduced the idea, medicine's making a big mistake. We're treating heart attacks and strokes and psychoses, but that's too late. That's like trying to treat young men who've crashed a car after they've crashed the car. You should try and treat them beforehand, get them to wear seat belts in the car so that even if they crash, they're not going to be as badly injured. The idea was to prevent problems. Now, Rose's idea was that you reduced salt in your diet. But the pharmaceutical industry looked at this and said, he wants to reduce blood pressure to prevent strokes. We have just the pills for that. And this again takes us back to France. This is, I don't know if you guys know, but weighing scales for people were used in France first during the 1860s, before anywhere else in the world that I know of. And 10 years later, French doctors were talking about a new illness, which in English we called anorexia nervosa, and you call anorexia mentale. In the 1920s, pharmacies in a lot of the Western world had weighing scales in them with a metal plate on them, giving you your ideal weight for your height and sex. And eating disorders exploded. They became much more common. And in the 1960s, we all got bathroom weighing scales, and eating disorders became vastly more common again in countries that were using weighing scales, not anywhere else in the world. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the measurements become the illness, whether it's your bone densities or your blood glucose or your blood pressure or your peak flow rates are vaccine dashboards showing the number of cases that we have at any one point in time in the community. It's all the same approach. Once the industry know that once they generate numbers, whether by giving away free bone scanners or whatever, their pills will become an answer to the problem the numbers create. In 1970, if you look at the medical literature, you can find the word risk in the title of 200 articles, in either the title or the abstract of 200 articles. By 1990, the word risk is in the title of 20,000 articles. So there's been a huge shift from treating problems like what we used to call illnesses, to giving drugs to healthy people to manage risks. And you get people like Ulrich Beck writing books about the fact that we've become risk societies. Here's a behavioral technique that maps very closely onto what's happening here, which is it's algorithmic. Mesmerism or hypnosis is algorithmic. You've got the method being used to capture the attention of the person, and you're creating an if X then Y type of situation. Mesmerism was all the vogue in France in the 1780s and suggested to people that the social structure is itself suggested, and maybe we can change it for the better. We don't have to have the people who are on top of the social structure remaining there. And it provided an impetus to the French Revolution. So in the case of medicine, we've got if the figures for X are high or low, give brand Y. Okay, there's a big change happening during the 1980s. We get AIDS during the 1980s. We get drugs for AIDS in the mid-1990s. And there's very few drugs other than the drugs for AIDS, are Gleevec, are Salvadi, and a few drugs like that that save lives. As Goldman Sachs said recently, saving lives is not a good business model. Where the industry make their money, 90% of the money they make is giving drugs to healthy people. And one of the things about giving drugs to healthy people is you can treat them for multiple risk factors at the same time, where very few people have multiple illnesses at the same time. We talk these days about people having chronic medical conditions of which they have a few, but these are not medical conditions usually. These are risk factors. You've got slightly raised blood pressure or blood glucose or bone density thinning. These are not traditional illnesses. This is one more quick point to maybe one slide too many. This is about laxatives and the influence of regulation on the way we practice. There's 4 different kinds of laxatives here. Laxative principles. Laxatives are not magic bullets. Laxatives, there's 4 different ways to treat a constipation problem. The clinical skill is knowing what laxative you need to give to the person in front of you. And this is true of antihypertensives, this is true of antidepressants, it's true of hypoglycemics, it's true of all the drugs we use pretty well. But because they're called antihypertensive, or antidepressant, or laxative, doctors have got to thinking that I don't need to work out which drug this person needs. It's a laxative. Let's just give it. And we end up with people who have treatment-resistant constipation because we put them on 4 different kinds of laxatives, maybe 3 of which aren't helping and may make the problem worse. That's certainly the case with the antidepressants. Treatment-resistant depression didn't exist until recently. If you now look at the people who have it, they're on tons of different drugs, and there's no way to solve the problem, and a lot of them are increasingly applying for medical assistance in dying, which is a pretty grim situation. But it suits industry. In addition to treating risk factors, they're happy with the idea that you're giving 4 antihypertensives rather than 1. And this comes from the regulatory process which brands a drug as an antihypertensive. Yeah. Okay, 1 or 2 more quick things. Then, this is, in the case of the antidepressants, the trials show that more people die on active treatment than on placebo. And that's true for a lot of the drugs we use across medicine. So how do antidepressants get labeled as drugs that work? Well, the answer is here that we use rating scales. And the most famous rating scale is called the Hamilton Depression Rating Scale. And this is Max Hamilton, who was an old-style communist, as it turns out, but who's looking at the fact that his rating scale ends up very successful and is looking at it and figuring, well, it's going to standardize clinical interviews. This can be good and bad. From the point of view of managing health services, the people who run health services these days, and look at David Healy, doing a clinical interview, don't want me to be asking a patient, what do you think of the transfer of Kylian Mbappe from PSG to Real Madrid? They don't want me asking about the recipe for gazpacho soup or anything like that. But this can be often the best way to find out what a problem is. They want to see me using a thing like the Hamilton Rating Scale, which has a bunch of items on it like suicide and sleep and appetite and sex and things like that, all of which the condition and the pill can affect. The condition can make things worse, the pill can make things worse. So if I'm interviewing Bruno and ask him, has he been suicidal in the last week? And he says, yes, he's thought about trying to kill himself and actually tried to kill himself. On a rating scale like that, I'm encouraged to just score 4. But if it's the drug that's causing the problem, I should be scoring 0. If it's in a clinical trial, I won't be let ask him, look, let's hold the drug and see what happens. I'll just end up with a score of 4. And ultimately, in both clinical practice and research, by using a scale like this without the ability to make a judgment call, to test things out to see what's going on, I'm helping Bruno to live the life Pfizer want him to live. Up to 1980, Bruno came to me with a problem. My job was to help him live the life he wanted to live. With the instruments and measurements we use now, we're helping people live the life that a pharmaceutical company wants them to live. Now, I think I might have things slightly out of sequence, but that's okay. There's a few ways in which companies can hide adverse events. And one of them is here. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This page comes from a brochure of articles that have been ghostwritten for Pfizer on their ISRS antidepressant Zoloft. And Pfizer did 4 trials, all negative. FDA still approved this drug for PTSD. What happened, or how it worked, was the company picked out the fact that there was a marginal benefit among women in 2 of the trials. So that's what's being published here. Even though the effect is trivial, these articles are going to the very best journal in the field, the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA. And what you're being told, if you can read the small print up there, is the articles at this stage have been written. Over on the left-hand side, you see TBD, which is to be determined. The authors have not been decided. The articles are written, but the people whose names are going to feature on the authorship line aren't yet there. And this is going to be decided by Pfizer's marketing department. And if any of you is unsure about that, I can email you a document from Pfizer France showing that in the case of articles like this, the companies there are deciding who would be a good author for us to put on the authorship line in order to increase the sales of Zoloft here in France. In the case of all of the antidepressants we know and love, here's what the published literature looked like around 2008. The boxes up there are articles which say these antidepressants, which you see down the bottom, all work wonderfully well and are entirely safe. There's some negative trials, as you see, but broadly speaking, you'd figure this group of drugs were a reasonably safe group of drugs to be using for your patients. You wouldn't worry too much about using them. The problem is that FDA, the companies had sent their trials into FDA in addition to getting them published. And when you look at the FDA view of these trials, first of all, there were a number of negative trials that weren't published at all. But the crucial thing is 1/3 of the previously positive trials the company had told FDA and FDA had decided were negative, but they're published as positive. In the case of sertraline, over there on the right, you have to legally have 2 trials that are positive in order to get on the market. You can do 100 trials. If you've got 2 that are positive, you can get your drug labeled as an antidepressant. Sertraline is over here, and there's 2 trials that are positive. And most of the meta-analyses of the antidepressants suggest it's the drug you should be using. But if you look at the trials as FDA have them, there's only 1 positive trial, and in fact there are more negative trials per positive trial for that drug than any other drug. So if you are working out which drug to use, you would say it's the last drug you should be using. I should quickly mention around this time or shortly afterwards, well, roughly 50% of the trials done on the antidepressants in adults and children are negative. In the case of the trials done in children, they were 100% negative, and that includes the trials done for Prozac in children, which was licensed by FDA, and all regulators say, well, the other SSRIs may have a problem, but actually Prozac has been licensed, it's got great results. It hasn't. They were negative trials. Paroxetine was also approved by FDA for children on the back of 3 negative trials. A fuss blew up and the approval fell through. So back to mesmerism. The problem is doctors and the public are getting mesmerized. They're getting hypnotized. How do you avoid that happening? Well, one of the things you've got to avoid is you've got to avoid adverse events. When children become suicidal on these drugs, or adults become suicidal on antidepressants, the company response is to say, well, this just means they weren't a simple case of depression. They're bipolar disorder. And you've got to treat them with a mood stabilizer also. If the doctor and the patient buy that, the hypnosis deepens. It's when you don't buy that that you have a chance of not being hypnotized anymore. There's one more key way in which, and this is probably the key way in which companies hide problems. a story blew up in 1990 about Prozac causing people to commit suicide. The response from the company Eli Lilly was to meta-analyze their clinical trials. And this is an article from the BMJ saying, we've meta-analyzed our clinical trials and there's no evidence that Prozac causes people to commit suicide. There were three media lines that went with this. One was, there's reports around the place from the previous year of people reporting on patients becoming suicidal on this drug. You remove the drug, the problem clears up. You put them back in the drug, the problem reappears. It looked very clear from a clinical point of view that the drug caused the problem. The company response to that was, well, you have these reports and they're very sad, but they're anecdotes. And the plural of anecdote is not data. You've also got the company saying it's depression that causes people to commit suicide. It's not our drug. And the critical point was the point that, well, this is the science of cause and effect. The other stuff is anecdotes. And the key things you need to know is, first of all, the original phrase is the plural of anecdotes is data. And if that weren't the case, Google wouldn't work. You also need to know that the company had healthy volunteer trials where they gave Prozac and related drugs to healthy volunteers who went on to try and kill themselves and in some instances did kill themselves. So it doesn't need to be the illness. These drugs can cause people to commit suicide. But the key thing is that there was an excess of suicidal events in the Lilly trials. If you looked more closely at the data, you saw there was a statistically significant increase in the suicidal events in the Lilly trials. The only suicides were on Prozac and not on placebo. So the science of the RCT science maps onto what doctors were saying they could see in the clinic, which is probably reassuring to all of you. What you're not reassured by is the idea that the company has cooked the books, but that's just what we expect companies to do. But the point I'm trying to make, the key point I'm trying to make is an incompatibility between what doctors see and what the clinical trials show is not something that is a big problem. It's an incompatibility. An incompatibility is what science thrives on. It's a puzzle which we should want to find the answer to. And Lilly's saying you cannot believe what doctors are saying they see right in front of them is a religious position. It's like the Catholic Church and Galileo. They're refusing to accept the fact that there is an incompatibility, and this should be the kind of thing we thrive on. They're saying you are not allowed to say that your patient has become suicidal on this drug. This is misinformation is the word that we would use now. So it's creating a totally different climate to the one that we would expect to be part of science. There's an added feature to all this, which is in the 1950s, thanks to cybernetics, in manufacturing industry in the United States, tons of people lost their jobs. They were replaced by machines which were programmed to do the job instead. 80% of people had worked in the manufacturing sector. They moved into the service industries, the fast food industries, banking, and all sorts of things like that. At that point in time, in the 1950s, nobody expected medicine or universities to become part of the service industries. But that's exactly what happened around 1980. We got managers moving in. The point here is to bring out the managers who are on either side, who previously have been just running fast food outlets and things like that, who move into healthcare and manage doctors also. It leads to a change of climate, which is up till 1980, when patients brought problems to us that they wanted help to solve to live the life they wanted to live. Our job was to mobilize the resources of the hospital and the university, if need be, to help them with just that. Our job shifted, and we felt it, and they felt it. Our job became to ensure that they didn't pose a risk to the organization that was employing us. Rather than us being on their side, it became a case of we were on the organization's side, and potentially a problem for them. We, of course, could also cause problems to them by screening their cholesterol levels and saying, your cholesterol levels are high and you have to be treated, and if you're not treated, I'm going to discharge you from my list of patients. The patients don't get told that we get paid on the basis that 80% of the people, for instance, that have got raised cholesterol levels, we have to ensure that they get on a treatment. This is medical neoliberalism. It's neo-medicalism, if you want to call it something. It's a place, I mean, I think the point behind this talk is I think in healthcare you can see what neoliberalism means up close and personal in a way that you can't really see it in quite the same way in any other area of life. There's a phrase here that appeals to me. Managers, I mean, if you read any books about management science these days, it says managers manage what they can measure. And I think this cartoon brings the point home well. I think what we're seeing is a version of the King Midas story. Rather than everything turning to gold, what he's asked for is everything should turn to numbers. It should turn to science, and it has. Everything has turned to numbers, and it's incompatible with human care. This is a slide I use a lot, which brings you back to the bureaucrat issue. Yeah, and it's from the English phrase, I don't know if you got the same one. You can take a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You guys said that. Well, this is a play on that. That's okay, don't worry. Don't worry. So you can take a horse to water, but you can't make him think. But here's the key thing. Once you lead a doctor to a guideline, you can no longer make him think. Doctors used to be liberal professionals. And going back to Max Weber, at the heart of that was the idea you lead. Now, it doesn't mean you tell the patient, the patient has to do what you say, but you try and move things forward. You're not operating according to a procedure or a guideline. Doctors these days, at least in the Anglophone world that I live in, if you look at all the junior doctors in training under the age of 40 or maybe older than that, they really all they act in accordance with the guidelines. They cannot conceive of doing anything else, which of course means they're bureaucrats. They're operating according to a set of rules that have come from the top down. How do you break the hypnosis? Well, adverse events, as I've said to you, are key. When a patient has an adverse event, recognizing it as an adverse event will break the spell. Personal contact, me asking you about Kylian Mbappe or your gazpacho recipe, is the kind of thing that's likely to break the spell also, rather than just keep going through the questions on the rating scale. If anyone, either the person under hypnosis or the person who's hypnotizing them, exercises a judgment call, if there's a call which says this theater is on fire, and they decide, if the hypnotist decides to run out of the theater that might be on fire, or the patient decides, that's going to break the spell. It's when anyone exercises judgment that you break the spell, as Francis Kelsey did. So the argument is this, that when you think of neoliberalism, people often link it to the financial crisis in 2007-8, which was set by a bunch of targets against which hedge funds could bet and make a lot of money. We had what's called financialization, where money chases money at the same time. We've got more and more money, but people get poorer and poorer. This is the Piketty argument to some extent. What I think we've got here now is pharmaceuticalization, which is leading to drugs chasing drugs as life expectancy falls. And 1980 was the point that I told you was the point at which we began to introduce neoliberalism in healthcare. This is 1980, and this is the point at which we start treating risk factors. It's the point at which we figure all our antihypertensives are the same. We can give people 4 of them, and that's Sansa. better bet than just giving them one. And this is US life expectancy from 1980 through, and this is pre-COVID. Now you might say, well, what's happening here? You know, these things go up and down. But this was drug-induced as well. This is tobacco. So in all cases, the falls are linked to the drugs we use. We know that in the United States, 7 or 8 years ago, 40% of people over the age of 45 were on 3 or more drugs. 40% of people over the age of 65 were on 5 or more drugs. So that's gone up. We know that reducing your medication burden will reduce the risk that you go into hospital, will increase your life expectancy, and improve your quality of life. But there's a few things in the way. The lady in the middle's a pilot. If there's an adverse event on the plane flight, she reports it. If the system doesn't respond, she and her colleagues don't fly. Doesn't take a great deal of courage, it's just common sense. It wouldn't be a good idea to fly. The lady on the right is the boss of Citibank in New York. Her name is Jane Fraser, and she's helped put an early warning system in place for the same kind of thing that happened during 2007 happening again. I don't know that anyone really believes that it's going to stop things happening again. But the point I want to make is when we look back at the financial crisis, people talk about bankers and financiers being in a position of moral hazard. They sell you things like a mortgage, which can blow up in your face. You will be injured. They won't. They'll continue to collect the bonus. The more mortgages they sell, even if they blow up, the more they get paid. So there's no incentive for them to do good. It will require courage to do good. The person on the left's a doctor who's in the same kind of position as the bankers. When she reports on an adverse event, EMA and FDA file it away and do nothing about it. If she creates a stink about it, she loses her job. There's no incentive for her to be courageous and say, this drug has caused that problem. She's the consumer, but she consumes by putting the pill in your mouth, and you might explode. She'll continue to be paid if she keeps quiet, and if she doesn't keep quiet, well, she may not get paid. But stopping your drugs, reducing your medication burden isn't easy, as this slide from the Hurt Locker or de Minère, as it's in French, hopefully brings out, which is a lot of the drugs we're on, or we have people on, can explode when you try to stop them. The mix of all these drugs together can create its own problems. There's no randomized control trial that is ever going to be able to tell a doctor what to do in this position. It depends on his or her clinical skill, but in particular it depends on the relationship, the patient they're working with. The patient is the experimental apparatus who is on these pills, but who can talk back and inform us about what's going on and tell us, you know, when they missed particular pills, there were big problems. It gives us a big clue about what not to do. We are hooked on the idea that numbers are what give us objectivity, that rather than our judgment, if we just go by the numbers, we're being objective. And that's a position that really hasn't got statistical or mathematical support. We don't get objective by just adhering to the numbers, or, as I put it here, using chance to control bias. We become objective when we allow people to have an argument, to contest things. The patient, the doctor, a bunch of doctors to get together and work out what's the best way to explain this rather than anything else. That's the way we become scientific. Now, I'm just finished. This is Greta Thunberg. One of the paradoxes we have at the moment is you've got a younger generation around the place talking about the environment and the pollution of the environment. And looking at a set of figures, carbon dioxide figures, it's a target, we need to get it down. Greta Thunberg's generation, however, are consuming more drugs, particularly the psychotropic drugs, than any other generation in human history of their age have done. polypharmacy used to begin when people were in their 40s or 50s. It now begins in your teens, and possibly also in pregnancy, where the number of vaccines people are getting is escalating rapidly. But this generation don't seem to realize that, and don't seem to tie the pollution of the internal environment to the pollution of the external environment, and figure that maybe there's common factors here. There's Zygmunt Bauman, who was Polish and ended up in the UK, caused a fuss 20 years ago when he said Max Weber predicted the Holocaust. Weber said, you know, we've got to a point in medicine where we can efficiently bring people into the world much more safely than we did before. We can take people out of the world much more cleanly than we ever did before. And he even went on to say, you know, there are issues we can begin to face, like some lives are not worth living. We can technically solve this problem. So it was on that basis Bauman said, you know, the Holocaust is not just a picture on the wall. It's a window through which we're looking at our current world. And he said the key to it is, you know, solidarity, us working together, contesting things together, coming to a consensus view. He's not using the word us here in either a socialist or capitalist fashion. It's something else that he's trying to get at, which I think George Oppen, a poet in the United States, does quite well. He says, you know, each of us has to decide for ourselves, what does the word us mean for each of us? This is the Last Judgment. And to look at what everybody is saying about AI these days, you'd figure we're heading towards the Last Judgment, except it's going to be a secular Last Judgment. It's not going to be God turning up. It's going to be AI is going to decide just what our fate is. I don't know when any of you have read the Bible last, or if you know anything much about the Last Judgment scene, but in the Last Judgment scene, God is going to separate the sheep from the goats. And here's what, in English at least, but I'm not sure you have the same concept in France, unless you're a farmer. There's a concept of a Judas goat. And there's the sheep, and here's the goat. And the idea is you use the goat to lead the sheep to the abattoir where they're all going to be killed. That's why the word Judas is used. God, of course, saves the sheep and the goats get killed, but goats are key opinion leaders. Will the system be able to discard the goats and keep the sheep? Or some people might say doctors have become goats. Will the system hang on to doctors or not? Maybe it should hang on to doctors and get rid of all the excess people that we've got instead. Well, from an AI point of view, will AI treat us any differently to the way we treat animals? We talk about animal husbandry. Will it be human husbandry? We sell organs these days and things like that. From a public health point of view, we've got an agricultural approach, which conceivably could happen. Rather than placing value on an individual life, we just place value on the group. Medicultural approach. So this is the last slide. The creation myth is that God ultimately triumphs, and this is the Satan being killed by the Archangel Michael, I think. But one of the things that potentially can happen, with AI, one of the issues is there a group of powerful people who remain in control of it? One of the other options with AI is it can learn for itself. And it might decide, well, there's too many people in the world, it needs to reduce it by half. The Earth's much too polluted, etc., etc. Or it could decide it wants to keep us alive. And if it decided it wanted to keep us alive and was given a license to let some of us die in the process until it worked out how to keep us alive, one of the options, or one of the things you'd expect is that it would figure that listening to people and what we had to say about the effects of drugs on us was likely to be a better way to keep us alive than to go by a ghost-written fake literature. I mean, the greatest concentration of fake literature on earth at the moment centers on the drugs a doctor gives you and each of us. Which is the better way to keep us all alive? AI might decide listening to us was a much better bet. But as the final point, medicine, as we've practiced it since the French Revolution, is about bringing good out of evil. We do something like giving an anesthetic to put you to sleep. That risks killing you. When I talk about bringing good out of evil, I'm not talking about a Satan, an evil creature. Evil is the absence of good. We've got a technical means we can put you to sleep. It's neither good nor evil. Can we bring good out of it? So that's medicine. That's the medical model. That's what came into being with the French Revolution. I guess the question is, when God created the world and set all of this in motion, including the original struggle, did he or she bring good out of evil? And what are we doing with AI? Are we going to bring good out of evil? And how do we do that? Thanks.